The ecstatic unity of temporality, that is, the unity of the outside itself in the raptures and Tikkun of the future, the having been, and the present, is the condition of the possibility that there can be a being that exists as it's there. The being that bears the name Dasein is clear. The light that constitutes this clearness of Dasein is not a power or source, objectively present ontically, for a radiant brightness sometimes occurring in this being. What essentially clears this being, that is, makes it open as well as bright for itself, was defined as care before any temporal interpretation. Full disclosedness of the there is grounded in care. This clearedness first makes possible any illumination or throwing light, any perceiving, seeing, or having of something. We understand the light of this clearedness only if we do not look for an innate, objectively present power, but rather question the whole constitution of being of Dasein, care, as to the unified ground of its existential possibility. Ecstatic temporality clears the there primordially. It is the primary regulator of the possible unity of all the essential existential structures of Dasein. Only in terms of the rootedness of Dasein and temporality do we gain insight into the existential possibility of the phenomenon that we characterized at the beginning of our analytic of Dasein as its fundamental constitution, namely, being in the world. At the beginning, it was a matter of securing the unbreakable structural unity of this phenomenon. The question of the ground of the possible unity of this articulated structure remained in the background. With the intention of protecting the phenomenon from the most obvious, and thus the most fatal tendencies to divide it up, the everyday mode of being in the world closest to us taking care of inner-worldly beings at hand was interpreted more extensively. Now that care itself has been ontologically defined and traced back to temporality as its existential ground, taking care in its turn can be conceived explicitly in terms of care or temporality. Our analysis of the temporality of taking care initially kept to the mode of circumspectly having to do with things at hand. Then it followed up the existential and temporal possibility that circumspect taking care may be modified into a discovering of inner-worldly beings in the sense of certain possibilities of scientific investigation, and discovering them by only looking at them. Our interpretation of the temporality of the being together with inner-worldly things at hand and objectively present, being together circumspectly as well as theoretically taking care shows, at the same time, how the same temporality is already the advanced condition of the possibility of being in the world, in which being together with inner-worldly beings is grounded as such. The thematic analysis of the temporal constitution of being in Thewworld led to the following questions. How is something like world possible at all? In what sense is world? What and how does the world transcend? How are independent, inner-worldly beings connected with the transcending world? The ontological exposition of these questions does not already entail their answer. On the other hand, it does bring about the clarification, previously necessary, of the structures with reference to which the problem of transcendence is to be interrogated. The existential and temporal interpretation of being in the world will consider three things. A. The temporality of circumspect taking care. B. The temporal meaning of the modification of circumspect taking care into theoretical knowledge of inner-worldly things objectively present. C. The temporal problem of the transcendence of the world. A. The temporality of circumspect taking care. How are we to gain the perspective for an analysis of the temporality of taking care? Called heedful being together with the world, are dealing in and with the surrounding world 14 as examples of the phenomena of being together with. We chose the using, handling, and producing of things at hand, and their deficient and undifferentiated modes. That is, the being together with things that belong to everyday need 15. The authentic existence of Dasein also maintains itself in such taking care, even when it remains indifferent for it. Things at hand taken care of are not the cause of taking care, as if this were to arise only on the basis of the effects of inner-worldly being. Being together with things at hand can neither be explained ontically in terms of those things at hand, nor can things at hand be derived from this kind of being. Taking care as a kind of being of Dasein and things taken care of as inner-worldly things at hand are, however, not simply present together. Nevertheless, there is a connection between them, properly understood, whereby of what is dealt with sheds light on heedful dealing itself. On the other hand, if we miss the phenomenal structure of the whereby of dealings, we fail to recognize the existential constitution of such dealing. It is indeed already an essential gain for the analysis of the beings encountered nearest to us if their specific handy character is not omitted. But we must understand further that heedful dealing never has to do with a single useful thing. Using and handling a definite useful thing remains as such oriented toward a context of useful thing. If, for example, we look for a misplaced, useful thing, we do not mean by this simply and primarily only what is looked for in an isolated act, but the context of the whole of useful things has already been discovered. Any going to work and reaching for something does not bump up against a useful thing given in isolation out of nothingness, but in taking hold of a useful thing, we come back to the useful thing grasped from the work world that has always already been disclosed. If in our analysis of dealing with things we aim at what we have to do with, our existent being together with beings taken care of must be given an orientation not toward an isolated useful thing at hand, but rather toward the totality of useful things. Our reflection upon the eminent character of being of useful things at hand, relevance, also forces us to this conception of what we have to do with. We understand the term relevance ontologically. To say that something has a relevance with, and in something else is not supposed to ontically ascertain a fact, but to indicate the kind of being of things at hand. The relational character of relevance, with its together with, points to the fact that a useful thing is ontologically impossible. Indeed, a single useful thing may be at hand, while another is missing. But here the fact makes itself known that one thing at hand belongs to the other. Heedful dealings can only let things at hand be encountered circumspectly, if it already understands something like a relevance in which things are. The being together with, that takes care in a way that circumspectly discovers amounts to letting something be in relevance, that is, to projecting relevance understanding. If letting things be relevant constitutes the existential structure of taking care, and if the latter as being together with, belongs to the essential constitution of care, and if care in its turn is grounded in temporality, then the existential condition of the possibility of letting something be relevant must be sought in a mode of the temporalizing of temporality. Letting something be relevant is found in the simplest handling of a useful thing. Relevance has an intentional character, with reference to which the thing is usable or in use. Understanding the intention wazu and context wobai of relevance has the temporal structure of awaiting. Waiting the intention, taking care can at the same time come back to something like relevance. Waiting Juortigen, the context wobai, and retaining behout, the means of wamit relevance, make possible in its ecstatic unity, the specifically handy way in which the useful thing is made present. Waiting the towards which wazu is neither a reflection upon the goal, nor an expectation of the imminent completion of the work to be produced. It does not have the nature of a thematic grasping at all. Nor does retaining what is relevant mean holding fast to it thematically. Handling things is no more related merely to what it handles than to what it uses in relevance. Rather, being relevant constitutes itself in the unity of awaiting and retaining in such a way that the making present arising from this makes the characteristic absorption in taking care in the world of its useful things possible. When one is really busy with something and totally immersed in it, one is neither only together with the work, nor with the tools, nor with both together. Being in relevance, which is grounded in temporality, has already founded the unity of the relations in which taking care moves circumspectly. A specific kind of forgetting is essential for the temporality that constitutes being irrelevant. In order to be able to really get to work, lost in the world of tools and to handle them, the self must forget itself. But since an awaiting is always guiding in the unity of the temporalizing of taking care, the almost potentiality of being of Dasein, taking care, is nevertheless placed in care, as we shall show. The making present that awaits and retains constitutes the familiarity in accordance with which Dasein knows its way around, as being with one another in the public surrounding world. We understand letting things be in relevance existentially as letting be. On its basis, things at hand can be encountered by circumspection as the beings that they are. We can thus further clarify the temporality of taking care if we pay attention to the modes of circumspectly letting something be encountered that were characterized before, as conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy. The useful thing at hand is precisely not encountered with regard to its true in itself, by a thematic perception of things, but is encountered in the inconspicuousness of what is found obviously and objectively. But if something is conspicuous in the totality of such beings, then this implies the possibility that the totality of useful things as such also obtrudes itself. How must letting things be in relevance be structured existentially, so that it can let something conspicuous be encountered? This question is not aiming at factical occasions that direct our attention to something already given, but at the ontological meaning of this ability to direct our attention as such. Things that cannot be used, for example, a tool that will not work, can be conspicuous only in and for someone using them. Even the most sharp and persistent perception and representation of things could never discover something like damage to the tool. The using must be able to be hampered so that something unhandy can be encountered. But what does this mean ontologically? The making present that awaits and retains is held up with regard to its absorption in the relevant relations, and it is held up by something which afterwards turns out to be a damage. The making present, which equiprimordially awaits the what for, is held fast with the tool used in such a way that the what for and the in order to are now explicitly encountered for the first time. However, making present itself can only meet up with something unsuited for, because it is already moving in an awaiting retention of what is in relevance. Making present is held up, that is, in the unity of the awaiting that retains, it shifts more to itself, and thus constitutes the inspection, checking, and removal of the disruption. If heedful dealings were simply a succession of experiences occurring in time, and if these experiences associated with each other as intimately as possible, letting a conspicuous, unusable tool be encountered would be ontologically impossible. Whatever we have made accessible in contexts of useful things, letting things be in relevance as such must be grounded in the ecstatic unity of the making present that awaits and retains. And how it is possible to ascertain that something is missing, that is, unhandy and not just at hand in an unhandy way. Unhandy things are not discovered circumspectly in missing something. Finding out that something is not objectively present is based upon missing something, and both have their own existential presupposition. Missing something is by no means a not making present, but is a deficient mode of the present in the sense of the not making present of something expected or always already available. If circumspect letting things be relevant were not awaiting what is taken care of from the very beginning, and if awaiting did not temporalize itself in the unity with a making present, Dasein could never find out that something is missing. On the other hand, the possibility of being surprised lies in the fact that the making present that awaits a thing does not await something else that stands in a possible context of relevance with the former. The not awaiting of the making present that is lost first discloses the horizontal leeway in which something surprising can overcome Dasein. That with which heedful dealings fail to cope, either by producing or procuring something, or even by turning away, keeping at a distance, protecting oneself from something, is revealed in its insurmountability. Taking care reconciles itself with this. But reconciling with something is a mode peculiar to circumspectly letting something be encountered. On the basis of this discovery, taking care can find what is inconvenient, disturbing, hindering, jeopardizing, or in general resistant in some way. The temporal structure of reconciling oneself with something lies in a non-retention that awaits and makes present. The making present that awaits does not, for example, count on something that is unsuitable but is nevertheless available. Not counting on is a mode of taking into account what one cannot hold on to. It is not forgotten, but retained so that it remains at hand precisely in its unsuitability. Things at hand like this belong to the everyday content of the factically disclosed surrounding world. Only because things offering resistance are disclosed on the basis of the ecstatic temporality of taking care, can factical Dasein understand itself in its abandonment to a world of which it never becomes master. Even if taking care remains restricted to the urgency of everyday needs, it is never a pure making present, but arises from a retention that awaits on the basis of such retention, or as such a basis. Dasein exists in a world. For this reason, factically existing Dasein in a way always already knows its way around, even in a strange world. When in taking care, one lets something be in relevance, one's doing so is founded upon temporality, and amounts to an altogether pre-ontological and unthematic way of understanding relevance in things at hand. In what follows, we shall show how the understanding of these determinations of being as such is, in the end, also founded in temporality. We must first demonstrate the temporality of being in the world still more concretely. With this as our aim, we shall trace how the theoretical mode of behavior toward the world arises out of circumspect taking care of things at hand. The circumspect, as well as the theoretical discovery of inner-worldly beings, is based upon being in the world. The existential and temporal interpretation of these ways of discovering will prepare the temporal characterization of this fundamental constitution of Dasein. b. The temporal meaning of the way in which circumspect taking care becomes modified into the theoretical discovery of that which is present within the world, when in the course of our existential and ontological analyses we ask about how theoretical discovery arises from circumspect taking care. This means that we are not making a problem out of the ontic history and development of science, or of its factical occasions, or of its proximate goal. In searching for the ontological genesis of the theoretical mode of behavior, we are asking which of those conditions of possibility in the constitution of being of Dasein are existentially necessary for Dasein to be able to exist in the mode of scientific investigation. This question aims at an existential concept of science. This is distinct from the logical concept that understands science with regard to its results and defines it as a context of causal relations of true, that is, valid proposition. The existential concept understands science as a mode of existence, and thus a mode of being in the world which discovers or discloses beings or being. However, a completely adequate existential interpretation of science cannot be carried out until the meaning of being and the connection between being and truth have been clarified in terms of the temporality of existence. The following considerations are to prepare the understanding of this central problematic within which the idea of phenomenology can first be developed, as opposed to the preconception 19 indicated in an introductory fashion. In accordance with the stage of our study attained up to now, a further restriction will be imposed upon our interpretation of the theoretical mode of behavior. We are only inquiring into the way in which circumspect taking care of things at hand changes over into the investigation of things objectively present found in the world, and we shall be guided by the aim of penetrating to the temporal constitution of being in the world in general. In characterizing the transformation Umschlag from practically circumspect handling and using, and so on, to theoretical investigation, it would be easy to suggest that merely looking at beings is something that emerges when taking care abstains from any kind of use. Then what is decisive about the origin of theoretical behavior would lie in the disappearance of praxis. So if one posits practical, taking care as the primary and predominant kind of being of factical Dasein, the ontological possibility of theory will be due to the absence of praxis, that is, to a privation. But stopping a specific kind of use in heedful dealing does not simply leave its guiding circumspection behind as a remnant. Rather, taking care then transposes itself explicitly into just looking around. But this is by no means the way in which the theoretical attitude of science is reached. On the contrary, the lingering verwillen which comes about when busyness is abandoned can acquire the quality of a more precise kind of circumspection, such as inspecting, checking what has been attained, as looking over the operations just now at a standstill. To refrain from the use of tools is so far from theory that lingering, reflecting circumspection remains completely stuck in the tools at hand, taken care of. Practical dealings have their own way of lingering. And just as praxis has its own specific site, theoretical research is not without its own praxis. Reading off the measurements that result from an experiment often requires a complicated technological setup for the experimental arrangement. Observing with the microscope is dependent upon the production of prepared slides. Archaeological excavation that precedes any interpretation of the findings demands the most massive manual labor. But even the most abstract working out of problems and refining what has been gained uses, for example, writing material. As uninteresting and obvious as these components of scientific investigation may be, they are by no means ontologically indifferent. The explicit reference to the fact that scientific behavior as a way of being in the world is not only a purely intellectual activity, might seem unnecessarily complicated and superfluous. If only it did not become clear from this triviality that it is by no means obvious where the ontological boundary between theoretical and atheoretical behavior really lies. One will want to assert that all manipulation in the sciences is only in the service of pure observation, of the investigating discovery and disclosure of the things themselves. Taken in its broadest sense, seeing regulates all procedures and retains its priority. To whatever kind of objects one's knowledge may relate itself, and by whatever means it may do so, still that through which it relates itself to them immediately, and which all thinking as a means has as its goal is intuition. 20. The idea of the intuitus has guided all interpretation of knowledge ever since the beginning of Greek ontology up to today, whether that intuition is actually attainable or not. In accordance with the priority of seeing, The demonstration of the existential genesis of science will have to start out by characterizing the circumspection that guides practical taking care of things. Circumspection moves in the relevant relations of the context of useful things at hand. It itself is again subject to the guidance of a more or less explicit view over Übersicht, the totality of useful things in every world of tools, and the public surrounding world belonging to it. This overview is not simply one that subsequently scrapes objectively present things together. What is essential in this overview is the primary understanding of the totality of relevance within which factical taking care always starts out. The overview which illuminates taking care gets its light from the potentiality of being of Dasein for the sake of which taking care exists as care. The circumspection of taking care that has this overview brings things at hand nearer to Dasein in its actual using and handling in the mode of interpreting what it has seen. We call the specific bringing near of what is taken care of by interpreting it circumspectly deliberation Überlegung. The schema peculiar to it is if, then, if this or that is to be produced, put into use, or prevented, for example, then we need these or those means, ways, circumstances, or opportunity. Circumspect deliberation throws light on the actual factical position of Dasein in the surrounding world taken care of. Thus it never simply confirms the objective presence of a being or of its quality. Deliberation can also come about without what is circumspectly approach itself being concretely at hand or present within reach situation. Bringing the surrounding world near in circumspect deliberation has the existential meaning of making present Gegenwärtigung. For visualization, Vergegenwärtigung is only a mode of making present. In it, deliberation catches sight directly of what is needed, but not at hand. Circumspection that visualizes Vergegenwärtigende Umsicht does not relate itself to mere representations, Bloff 3 Vorstellung. But circumspect making present is a phenomenon with more than one kind of foundation. First of all, it belongs to the full ecstatic unity of temporality. It is grounded in a retention of the context of useful things that Dasein takes care of in awaiting a possibility. What has already been disclosed in awaiting retention is brought nearer by one's deliberative making present or representing. But if deliberation is to be able to move in the scheme of if, then, taking care must already understand a context of relevance in an overview. What is addressed with the if must already be understood as this and that. For this, it is not necessary that the understanding of useful things be expressed predicative. The scheme, something as something, is already prefigured in the structure of pre-predicative understanding. The as structure is ontologically grounded in the temporality of understanding. Only because Dasein, awaiting a possibility, that is, here a what for, has come back to for this, that is, retains a thing at hand, can conversely the making present that belongs to this awaiting retention start with this retention and bring it explicitly nearer in its reference to the what for. The deliberation that brings near must, in the scheme of making present, adapt itself to the kind of being of what is to be brought near. The character of relevance of what is at hand is not first discovered by deliberation, but only gets brought near by it in such a way that it circumspectly lets that through which something is in relevance be seen as this. The way the present is rooted in the future, and in the having been is the existential and temporal condition of the possibility that what is projected in circumspect understanding can be brought nearer in a making present in such a way that the present must adapt itself to what is encountered in the horizon of awaiting retention. That is, it must interpret itself in the schema of the as structure. This answers our earlier question whether the as structure is existentially and ontologically connected with the phenomenon of projection. Like understanding and interpretation in general, the as is grounded in the ecstatic and horizontal unity of temporality. In our fundamental analysis of being, and indeed in connection with the interpretation of the is, which as a copula expresses the addressing of something as something, we must again make the as phenomenon thematic and define the concept of the schema existentially. However, what is the temporal characterization of circumspect deliberation, and its schemata supposed to contribute to answering our current question of the genesis of the theoretical mode of behavior? Only enough to clarify the situation of Dasein, in which a circumspect taking care changes over into theoretical discovery. We may then try to analyze this transformation itself following the guideline of an elemental statement of circumspect deliberation and its possible modification. In our circumspect use of tools, we can say that the hammer is too heavy or too light. Even the sentence that the hammer is heavy can express a heedful deliberation and mean that it is not light. That is, that it requires force to use it or it makes using it difficult. But the statement can also mean that the being before us, with which we are circumspectly familiar as a hammer, has a weight, namely, the property of heaviness. It exerts a pressure on what lies beneath it, and when that is removed, it falls. The discourse understood in this way is no longer in the horizon of the awaiting retention of a totality of useful things and its relations of relevance. What is said has been drawn from looking at what is appropriate for a being with mass. What is now in view is appropriate for the hammer, not as a tool, but as a corporeal thing that is subject to the law of gravity. Circumspect talk about being too heavy or too light no longer has any meaning. That is, the being now encountered of itself provides us with nothing in relation to which it could be found, too heavy or too light. Why does what we are talking about, the heavy hammer, show itself differently when our way of talking is modified? Not because we are keeping our distance from handling, nor because we are only looking away from the useful character of this being, but because we are looking at the thing at hand encountered in a new way as something objectively present. The understanding of being guiding the heedful dealings with inner-worldly beings has been transformed. But does this already constitute a scientific mode of behavior if we comprehend things at hand as something objectively present, instead of circumspectly deliberating about them? Moreover, even things at hand can be made a theme of scientific investigation and determination. For example, in examining someone's surrounding world, his milieu, in the context of a historiographical biography. The everyday context of useful things at hand, their historical origination and utilization, their factical role in Dasein, all these are the objects of the science of economics. Things at hand need not lose their character of being useful things in order to become the object of a science. A modification of our understanding of being seems not to be necessarily constitutive for the genesis of the theoretical mode of behavior toward things. Certainly not, if this modification is supposed to mean a change of the kind of being which, in understanding the being in question, we understand it to possess. In our first characterization of the genesis of the theoretical mode of behavior from circumspection, we have made basic a kind of theoretical grasping of inner-worldly beings, a physical nature, in which the modification of our understanding of being amounts to a transformation. In the physical statement that the hammer is heavy, we overlook not only the tool character of the being encountered, but thus also that which belongs to every useful thing at hand, its place plats. The place becomes indifferent. This does not mean that the objectively present thing loses its location, or altogether. Its place becomes a position still in space and time, a world point, which is in no way distinguished from any other. This means that the multiplicity of places of useful things at hand within the confines of Umschrank, the surrounding world, is not simply modified to a mere multiplicity of positions. Rather, it means that the beings of the surrounding world are released from this confinement in Schrank. The totality of what is present becomes thematic. In this case, a releasing of the surrounding world belongs to the modification of the understanding of being. Following the guideline of the understanding of being in the sense of objective presence, this release becomes at the same time a delimitation of the region of what is objectively present. The more appropriately the being of the beings to be investigated is understood in the guiding understanding of being, and the more the totality of beings is articulated in its fundamental determinations as a possible area of subject matter for science, the more assured will be the actual perspective of methodological questioning. The classic example for the historical development of a science, and even for its ontological genesis, is the origin of mathematical physics. What is decisive for its development lies neither in its higher evaluation of the observation of facts, nor in the application of mathematics in determining events of nature, but the anatheanatical projection of nature itself. This project discovers in advance something constantly objectively present, matter, and opens the horizon for the guiding perspective on its quantitatively definable constitutive moments, motion, force, location, and time. Only in the light of a nature thus projected can something like a fact be found and be taken as a point of departure for an experiment defined and regulated in terms of this project. Founding of factual science was possible only because the researchers understood that there are in principle no bare facts. What is decisive about the mathematical project of nature is again not primarily the mathematical element as such, but the fact that this project discloses an a priori. And thus the paradigm of the mathematical natural sciences does not consist in its specific exactitude and binding character for everyone, but in the fact that in it, the thematic beings are discovered in the only way that beings can be discovered, in the prior project of their constitution of being. When the basic concepts of the understanding of being by which we are guided have been worked out, the methods, the structure of conceptuality, the relevant possibility of truth and certainty, the kind of grounding and proof, the mode of being binding and the kind of communication, all these will be determined. The totality of these moments constitutes the complete existential concept of science. The scientific project of the beings, somehow always already encountered, lets their kind of being be explicitly understood in such a way that the possible ways of purely discovering inner-worldly beings thus become evident. The articulation of the understanding of being, the definition of the subject matter defined by that understanding, and the prefiguration of the concepts suitable to these beings, all belong to the totality of this projecting that we call thanatization. It aims at freeing beings encountered within the world in such a way that they can project themselves back upon pure discovery. That is, they can become objects. Thematization objectifies. It does not first posit beings, but frees them in such a way that they become, objectively, subject to questioning and definition. The objectifying being together with inner-worldly things objectively present has the character of a distinctive kind of making it, is above all distinguished from the present of circumspection, by the fact that the discovering of the science in question solely awaits the discoveredness of what is present. This awaiting of discoveredness is grounded, existentially, in a resoluteness of Dasein, by means of which it projects itself upon its potentiality of being in the truth. This project is possible because being in the truth constitutes a determination of the existence of Dasein. How science has its origin in authentic existence is not to be pursued here. It is simply a matter of understanding that, and how the thematization of inner-worldly beings presupposes being in the world as the fundamental constitution of Dasein. If the thematization of what is present, the scientific projection of nature, is to become possible, Dasein must transcend the being's thematized. Transcendence does not consist in objectification, rather objectification presupposes transcendence. But if the thematization of inner-worldly beings objectively present is a transformation from taking care which circumspectly discovers, then a transcendence of Dasein must already underlie practical being together with things at hand. Furthermore, if thematization modifies and articulates the understanding of being, insofar as Dasein, the being that thematizes, exists, it must already understand something like being. This understanding of being can remain neutral. Then handiness and objective presence are not differentiated, still less are they conceived ontologically. But for Dasein to be able to have something to do with a context of useful things, it must understand something like relevance, even if only unthematically. A world must be disclosed to it. The world is disclosed with the factical existence of Dasein, if indeed Dasein essentially exists as being in the world. And if the being of Dasein is completely grounded in temporality, temporality must make possible being in the world, and thus the transcendence of Dasein, which in its turn supports the being together with inner-worldly beings that takes care, whether theoretical or practical. See, the temporal problem of the transcendence of the world, the understanding of a totality of relevance inherent in circumspect taking care, is grounded in a previous understanding of the relations of in order to, what for that and for the sake of which. We set forth the connection of these relations, as their unity constitutes what we call world. Now the question arises of how something like world in its unity with Dasein is ontologically possible. In what way must world be, such that Dasein can exist as being in theory? Dasein exists for the sake of a potentiality of being of itself. Existing, it is thrown, and as thrown, it is delivered over to beings that it needs in order to be able to be as it is, namely for the sake of itself. Since Dasein exists factically, it understands itself in this connection of the for the sake of itself, in each instance within an order to. That within which existing Dasein understands itself is there, together with its factical existence. The wherein of primary self-understanding has the kind of being of Dasein. Existing Dasein is its world. We define the being of Dasein as care. Its ontological meaning is temporality. We showed that, and how temporality constitutes the disclosedness of the there. World is also disclosed in the disclosedness of the there. The unity of significance, that is, the ontological constitution of the world, must then also be grounded in temporality. The existential and temporal condition of the possibility of the world lies in the fact that temporality, as an ecstatical unity, has something like a horizon. The ecstasies are not simply raptures in Truckungen toward. Rather, a whereto of being transported in Truckung belongs to each ecstasy. We call this whereto of the ecstasy the horizontal schema. The ecstatical horizon is different in each of the three ecstasies. The schema in which Dasein comes back to itself futurally, whether authentically or inauthentically, is the for the sake of itself. We call the schema in which Dasein is disclosed to itself in attunement as thrown, that in the face of which it has been thrown, and that to which it has been delivered over. It characterizes the horizontal structure of the having been. Existing for the sake of itself, in being delivered over to itself as thrown, Dasein is at the same time making present as being together with. The horizontal schema of the present is determined by the in order to. The unity of the horizontal schemata of future, having been, and present is grounded in the ecstatic unity of temporality. The horizon of the whole of temporality determines that upon which the being factically existing is essentially disclosed. With factical Dasein, a potentiality of being is always projected in the horizon of the future. Already being is disclosed in the horizon of the having been, and what is taken care of is discovered in the horizon of the present. The horizontal unity of the schemata of the ecstasies makes possible the primordial connection of the relations of the in order to with the for the sake of which. This means that on the basis of the horizontal constitution of the ecstatic unity of temporality, something like a disclosed world belongs to the being that is always its there. Just as the present arises in the unity of the temporalizing of temporality from the future and the having been, the horizon of a present temporalizes itself equiprimordially with those of the future and the having been. Insofar as Dasein temporalizes itself, a world is too. Temporalizing itself with regard to its being as temporality, Dasein is essentially, in a world, on the basis of the ecstatic and horizontal constitution of that temporality. The world is neither objectively present nor at hand, but temporalizes itself in temporality. It is, there, together with the outside itself of the ecstasy. If no Dasein exists, no world is there either. The world is already presupposed in one's being together with things at hand heedfully and factically, in one's thematization of what is present, and in one's objectifying discovery of the latter. That is, all these are possible only as modes of being in the world. The world is transcendent, grounded in the horizontal unity of ecstatic temporality. It must already be ecstatically disclosed, so that interworldly beings can be encountered from it. Temporality already holds itself ecstatically in the horizons of its ecstasies, and temporalizing itself comes back to the beings encountered in the there. With the factical existence of Dasein, interworldly beings are also already encountered. That such beings are discovered in the there of its own existence is not under the control of Dasein. Only what, in which direction, to what extent, and how it actually discovers and discloses is a matter of freedom, although always within the limits of its thrownness. The relations of significance that determine the structure of the world are thus not a network of forms that is imposed upon some material by a worldless subject. Rather, factical Dasein, ecstatically understanding itself and its world in the unity of the there, comes back from these horizons to the beings encountered in them. Coming back to these beings understandingly is the existential meaning of letting them be encountered and making them present. For this reason, they are called inner world. The world is, so to speak, already further outside than any object could ever be. The problem of transcendence cannot be reduced to the question of how does a subject get outside to an object, whereby the totality of objects is identified with the idea of the world. We must rather ask what makes it ontologically possible for beings to be encountered within the world and objectified as encountered being. Going back to the ecstatically and horizontally founding transcendence of the world will give us the answer. If the subject is conceived ontologically as existing Dasein, whose being sane is grounded in temporality, we must say then that the world is subjective. But this subjective world, as one that is temporally transcendent, is then more objective than any possible object. By tracing being in the world back to the ecstatic and horizontal unity of temporality, we have made the existential and ontological possibility of this fundamental constitution of Dasein intelligible. At the same time, it becomes clear that the concrete development of the structure of world in general, and of its possible variations, can be attempted only if an ontology of possible interworldly beings is oriented toward a clarified idea of being in general with sufficient assurance. The possible interpretation of this idea requires that we set forth the temporality of Dasein beforehand. Here our characterization of being in the world will be of service.